Thank you for that stellar introduction, and I just want to echo the thanks for everyone showing up so early this morning. My name is Clover. I'm the founder and executive director of a youth climate nonprofit called Force of Nature, and today I am joined by three incredible panelists who are absolute superstars in the climate space. Today's conversation is really going to be focused at the intersection of the climate crisis and mental health, and seeing as there's not one token young person, but four young people here today, we're also going to be talking about the role of intergenerational exchange. But rather than trying to introduce all of you myself, I'm going to pass over to you, Days, if you want to go ahead and share name, title, and the first moment you remember learning about the climate crisis.
Oh God, isn't that PTSD? So I'm Days Agaji. I'm a climate justice activist and a creative director at a media startup called Earthrise Studio. The first time I remember learning about the climate crisis was actually when I'd had some issues with my breathing once I moved back to London from the countryside, and my doctors were giving me very, answers like, oh, it's just like growing up, it's growing pains. And I was like, what does that even mean, So I was Googling, as every 16-year-old does when she finds out that she might be ill. And then I found out about air pollution. And then very quickly on that spiral, I found out about the climate crisis. And yeah, let's just say I'm here because I think it's urgent.
Thank you, Days. Dominique?
Hi everyone, I'm Dominique. I'm a climate justice activist based here in the UK and a student at the University of Birmingham. And I'm an organiser in Fridays for Future International, which is a global youth movement for climate justice, a member of Bad Activist Collective, which is about dismantling perfection in the climate movement and standing up for climate justice, and also in the UN Women Feminist Action for Climate Justice Coalition as representative of Fridays for Future. I have a lot of hats. I kind of dip my toes in everywhere, a lot of different campaigns and organisations, basically just trying to engage and mobilise people for intersectional and intergenerational climate justice. And the first time I found out about the climate crisis, very similar to Days, I discovered the high and illegal levels of air pollution in my area, and then started linking that to the climate crisis, and it really just went from there.
Hey, I'm Noga Levy-Rappaport. I'm also a student and a climate activist. I've been working in this space since I was about 17 years old, organising climate strikes across the UK and coordinating them internationally, working on climate educational reform and campaigning for a Green New Deal, as well as kind of broadening the scope to work on youth enfranchisement and empowerment initiatives. Recently, I've been working on a number of community regenerative projects, such as Guy's Garden, which is a little pop-up space in the middle of London that I ran for a few months last year, which is all about reconnecting with creative and collaborative sides of community organising and inspiring as many people as possible to understand that climate justice activism and organising is for everyone, and it can be accessed in a number of different ways. The first time I ever learned about the climate crisis, I was 6 years old, and I remember it so well because it shaped the next 10 years of my life. I was sat in a school assembly, and we were just shown what I guess was just a picture of some clouds, and we were told, this is the ozone layer, it's got a hole in it, that's going to kill the world. The only way to stop this is to get all your fathers to stop shaving using aerosol cans and find an eco-friendly way of doing that. And that was all we were told. And this, for me, for the next 10 years of my life, until the first wave of kind of youth climate organising in early 2019 took place, I thought that the climate crisis was inevitable. I was totally paralysed.
Thank you all so much for sharing. As much as I do my best to suppress my accent, I am Australian, and I grew up in tropical North Queensland in Australia, very much with this deep relationship to the natural world. And I remember very distinctly watching documentaries for the first time. I was 11, I sat glued to my computer screen watching An Inconvenient Truth by Al Gore. And I remember feeling flooded with this kind of paralysis, this feeling of frustration, anger, anxiety, but I also remember feeling really, really confused. And I'm not sure if this was a similar experience for you as well, but I kept asking, how have I never learnt about this in school? How have we not talked about this at the dinner table? How have I not seen this on the TV when my parents watch the news? So it was waking up to the enormity of this crisis and realizing that in many ways I'd been kept in the dark my entire life. So I'd love to hear from each of you, and maybe I'll ping pong this straight back to you, Noga. Why do you think this crisis is unique for young people today? And how might the climate crisis feel different from threats faced by other generations, maybe our parents' generation?
I think as young people, and I'm sure everyone else will echo this, we have a tendency and a moral duty to be on the front lines of social justice activism. It's something that we can see in practically every movement that's ever happened. We're always right at the forefront, pushing every single agenda, creating, enacting, and like driving conversations forward, because we understand dependency and community so strongly, that we understand and engage with that feeling of solidarity and connection and building a movement in a really innate way. But I think with the climate crisis, where the trouble comes from is that firstly, we have been kept in the dark for a really long time. And we know from like the 80s that companies like ExxonMobil were purposefully shutting out reports and climate scientists. We know that the enormity of this crisis in part comes from the closing time frame. And that urgency creates a feeling that I think sort of exists in a limbo between paralysis and like total all-out angered burnout, which is that we spent so much of our lives being in the dark and so paralyzed, and that led to a complete apathy for a lot of us. And now, after all this time, we were told there's no point planning for your future because this is inevitable. Like, it's going to be an apocalypse in 20 years anyway. What's the point? We're now in the space where, oh my God, if I don't throw everything out the window and commit my entire life, as everyone here has, to fighting climate change, there will be no future anyways. And I think that has created a desperation that we've been able to channel very well into organizing and into building protests, because the lack of choice that we have it's not just life-threatening on an individual level, it's world-ending. And that's the whole issue with this crisis. And then I think you have the flip side, which is that we all know that any real and holistic solution to this crisis will resolve and must resolve any other political facet of our system that has brought so many people into crisis and into emergency status. And so I think we have this total devastation that is driving us and this complete desperation. And then we also have this possibility of an incredible solution. And I think that has marked this into a very, very unique crisis and formed a very unique generation.
Super interesting. Dominique?
Yeah, definitely echo what Noga was saying there. I think the urgency of the climate crisis has really, it really takes on a different, aspect for us than previous movements in the past have, because it's the biggest existential crisis that we've ever faced. And so when we do learn about climate and ecological breakdown, we learn, there's also a time frame which we need to act in. And as a young person, it can feel incredibly difficult to try and create change, and a lot of young people feel so disempowered and feel really removed from these spaces and feel like they don't have the power to create that change. And so both of those aspects together really makes for a really intense movement and feelings that are on young people, and also a lot of eco-anxiety, which we'll be talking more about later. And also then when it comes to climate justice, which talks about the intersections of these different, the interlinks between these different aspects of the climate crisis, which include different social issues. And when you learn about those, it can feel incredibly overwhelming, because previous movements focused a lot more on very particular issues and very particular policies and attitude changes and behavioral changes. And when it comes to the climate crisis, there's so much involved rather than just simply reducing emissions. So it can feel incredibly overwhelming. And that's why I feel like it's so unique for young people as well. And for me, it's really been a journey of picking what aspect of the climate crisis that I want to stand up against and really work on. I think that has been a really unique part of it, the urgency and what can feel incredibly overwhelming for young people, and that we have the most at stake as a generation, even though this is incredibly intergenerational.
And I also feel that there is this really unhelpful rhetoric of the responsibility lying with young people. And I'm sure we can all relate to that experience of being that token young person on a panel where you're kind of handed the microphone. It's like, great, so we're handing over the baton. How are young people going to solve the problem? And it's like, with what resources? Like, with what influence? You know, we're systematically being excluded from the decisions that are ultimately governing our future. And increasingly, we're being handed the microphone, but we're not actually being invited into those spaces. What has your experience been, Days?
Oh yeah, definitely. I feel like it's been kind of like they hand you the microphone, they're like, spill your trauma, and then we're not going to do anything about it. And that's the feeling of like, I think being young and kind of like having basically the rug pulled out from underneath your feet. You know, I remember I had planned, I'm always one of those planners, well, before I started activism, I was like, I had a 10-year plan. I knew exactly what university I wanted to go to, exactly what degree I wanted to go to, how I'm going to get to my dream job of being a historian, you know. And I was like, yeah, this is the path that I'm on. And then the climate crisis kind of shattered that and went, yeah, I think different. And I think there is something about like, creating space for grief and loss around the future that you hoped you would have. And especially when it comes to the climate crisis, that is everything. You know, we were told we'll, you know, be able to live our widest dreams. But in reality, we're watching the places that we love the most being taken away by flooding. We're watching people who we love dearly, especially as a member of the diaspora, literally being affected daily by the climate crisis, whether this is extreme heat, whether this is changes to biodiversity, everything makes a difference. And I think that sometimes can feel extremely overwhelming. And I don't think that society leaves enough space for that kind of like deep mourning. And I feel like when we start to think about like how can we solve it, that's another layer of complication. Because like from someone who's part of like almost every single oppressed group, there's a lot more problems than the climate crisis. The climate crisis is just the one that will end it all. And I feel like a lot of the time it's not given space to say like, how did we get here? We got here because of lack of connection to nature, lack of connections to ourselves. We got here because everything else is messed up, you know? So it just feels like one of those like big, like we basically need a whole paradigm shift of the way that we do everything to be able to save our planets, but then also save ourselves. Because I always say, before the climate crisis gets us, we'll end up eating each other. And that's the reality of what we're seeing all over the world with polarized democracies. You know? Yeah, so it's a really big task. It's a really big one, and I think this generation, I think there's something about the resilience of all the experiences that we've had, whether that's growing up in austerity, growing up in a pandemic now. You know, like we are a really resilient bunch, and I think if anything, we're going to be the ones who sort this out, so the next generation doesn't have to have their youth stolen.
That was very powerful. Thank you. We've been doing some interesting research around the intersection of mental health and climate in young people at Force of Nature for a couple of years now. But we recently shifted that lens to understanding mental health within organizations, looking at decision makers. And this is very early stages, but we found a really, really interesting kind of separation in the way that young people think about responsibility versus those in historic seats of power. So we asked this question of, where do you think responsibility lies for solving the climate crisis? And almost universally in the young people we asked that question, it sits with me, right? It's my responsibility to show up. And yet, in many, many, many of the business leaders that we work with the policymakers we've engaged with, the response is, oh no, it lies out there. So with business, it lies with policy, or with policy, it lies with business. And I think it is that huge weight of responsibility which is such a driver for these feelings of just being completely overwhelmed and kind of inundated. It's looking at the problem and seeing how deeply flawed and broken the system is, but also often feeling too small to make a difference, and realizing that you are being locked out of the changes that you can make on a system level. And we've also kind of been fed this narrative of consumerism, right? It's like the best that you can do is buy your reusable coffee cup, turn off the lights when you leave a room. I remember the like absolute awe and anger that I felt when I learned that BP had in fact come up with the carbon footprint calculator. I was like, oh, here's this seemingly innocent tool that we can use to think about our own individual carbon footprint. And actually this has been created as a marketing deception tool, a propaganda campaign to really shine attention away from the way that the fossil fuel industry is operating, and couple that guilt and shame and place that on the individual. So I'd love to hear from each of you, what has your experience been in kind of navigating this idea of responsibility and managing your expectations of what you can do as an individual while holding accountable the institutions, the huge organizations, and people in those seats of power who have ultimately created this crisis. Do you want to start, Days?
I think what I can do is be a pain in the ass, and I think I'm being very successful at it at the moment. I think it's overwhelming. I do think that within young people there is this like innate feeling of responsibility, definitely. And it's quite funny how I've done so many consultancy gigs of where I'm talking to these leaders of massive global corporations, and they go, yeah, but it's just me, right? And I'm like, yeah, just you. It's like the CEO of one of the biggest news channels in the UK. You know what I mean? The person who we expect to kind of be able to do things that are of service to society, and they don't feel empowered within themselves, And I think this is where young people can step up and basically be like, I feel empowered in myself, and this is how I'm going to get you there, whether you like it or not, because this is our future. And I think there is something about holding personal responsibility, but then also recognizing that you are just one small part in this massive machine, and you just have to trust someone else is out there doing the exact same thing. And I think our generation has very much shown that we are all working together, whether we see our work. It's different, whether you directly I see what you do day to day, or do I see what you guys do day to day? That's a different thing. But I know that out there is someone who's on the same side as me. There is someone fighting the same fight, and we'll get there in the end. And I think there's something that's really kind of amazing about that, because that means you only do what you can do, and especially I think the one bit of amazing advice that I got from my friend and fellow activist, Sam Roderick, was basically you kind of have to do things that feel like it's the right thing to do rather than thinking about the goal in itself. And that just by doing the right thing, things will work out in the end. And that's kind of the ideas of how do we bring good intentions to all of our actions? How do we make sure that has a ripple effect? And I think it's not about seeing the effect, but it's about knowing that it's happening. It makes it feel really empowering to do work, even if it may feel quite solo. You're part of one bigger movement that's somewhere out there that's so big that we can't even tangibly even comprehend it, and that's really powerful.
And I think we've been deeply conditioned to focus on the individual as well, and we can see how that then plays out in relating to these movements.
Exactly, and it's my mom always says, you can't use individual solutions to to kind of fight collective issues, and I think that's something we need to remind ourselves as well. We have to see ourselves as part of the collective, and if we don't, we're just going to be playing into the hands of the people who want to confuse us and who want us to fail so they can continue to profit off destruction.
How about you, Tom?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we can't use the same tools that got us into this crisis to get out of the crisis. And also going on what Days was saying there is the difference I've seen in kind of the ideas of empowerment and theories of change between the young generation and older generations, especially when I've spoken at business conferences, for example, with really big corporations and companies. And I remember at one event after I'd finished speaking, I had a business leader come up to me and say, that's really made me think that maybe I have a place within this. Maybe I can do something. I was like, yes, of course you can do something. You have so much power that I don't think has really sunk in for a lot of people in these positions yet. And I feel like for young people, we've caught on a lot more quickly on just how interlinked the crisis is and just where everyone's place is within it, and that everyone in that way truly can make a difference and truly does have the power to create change. And I haven't seen that yet truly reflected in these top levels. And I also feel as if the individualism as well that is presented is really harming action that can be taken and is really holding people back and making people more hesitant, because it's the idea that you as an individual alone can't change the world. It's like, of course you can't, but you're not alone. You're not the only person who's doing this. And when you think of your action as part of a collective, that's when change really starts. And that's when people start to really feel empowered. And that's something that's really kept me going in the movement, is being part of a collective and being part of a community that has really united together, knowing that it's not just on my shoulders alone. And I really think that aspect of collective action is so crucial, because a lot of the general public, for example, feel so disempowered and therefore so apathetic to what's happening with the climate crisis. And so I think that's really, really crucial.
Yeah, I think there is a baseline moral duty that every single person has, just by existing in a society that we know does not work and does not function in a way that actually benefits everyone. But I would say that whilst we all have a responsibility, not all responsibilities are equal. I think we've all touched on that, and it's really about your proximity to influence change that is how you calculate that level of responsibility and the extent to which you have to commit your time to creating change. And in some cases that means recognizing that countries across the West and the global North have an immense responsibility to eradicate third world debt, to pay lost and damaged finances, to pay their fair share, really, of the responsibility for causing the climate crisis in the first place, and for upholding and maintaining these systems that rely on extractivism of minerals on a scale that is simply too much for our planet to handle. And sometimes that means, looking at corporation leaders and also people who function in any company or any business, thinking about how close you are, to influencing policy, but also the impact that your own business has and the way in which that business functions, the effects that you're having around you. Sometimes that means totally reforming your models. Sometimes that means tearing your organization to the ground because the damage that you do is too great to be fixed. And sometimes that means funneling your money into community organizing, into opening up youth centers, into supporting enfranchisement of the people around you. It could mean, ensuring that voting registration is driven up the next election period. It can mean a number of different things, but that responsibility is really measured and defined by how close you are to power and to change. And I would say that the four of us are actually very far away from influencing power. The spaces that we've carved out for ourselves and fought very hard to create have brought us closer and closer to that influence. But realistically, compared to you guys, we're actually probably very, very far removed from that space. And I think it's very easy to show up to events like this and go, yeah, that was really inspiring. I'm sure we've all heard oh my God, you're doing so much for the world. Young people are just inspiring me so much. You're just saving the world. Which is...
No one's allowed to say that after this session.
Yeah, exactly. Which is obviously very important, but can be a very patronizing reminder that actually we have taken a lot on our shoulders that can be very crushing. It can be very difficult. It can lead to a lot of burnout. And this is a responsibility that, if it is not shared, will not have the outcome that we desperately require.
This idea of power is a really interesting one. And, I started out very much boots on the ground activism in Indonesia, kind of responding to local problems in my community. And I remember just being really confused by why it was that we'd had the technology, resources, ingenuity to solve this crisis for decades longer than any of us were born, and yet leaders were still showing up to COP each year and truly systemic institutional change was not happening. And then I remember having maybe a similar conversation to this one that you had, Dominique, with a leader where they had this kind of aha moment of, oh wow, but I actually have power, and I'm not powerless in the system. And I think that's been a huge eye-opener to realize that often, young people feel powerless because we don't have those spaces to show up within. But a lot of decision makers feel exactly the same way. And I think in many ways, they feel even more disempowered because they've been conditioned to the status quo for so long that they feel shackled to it. And it's very difficult for them to kind of get out of that myopic echo chamber of thinking, well, how might we actually do things differently? And that can often then manifest as a sort of denial of switching off from the problems, And denial shows up in lots of different ways. It can be like techno-utopianism as well, kind of like hedging your bets on these really far off, technological solutions when we have all of the solutions right here. And I think on the flip side, a lot of young people feel really powerless because we're so overcome by the anxiety, by the grief that you touched on, Days, by just the pain of it all. And so I'd love to hear from each of you, how do you see the intersection of kind of emotions in this climate crisis? And perhaps we can also talk about the universality of, eco-anxiety and those experiences, but how it might also differ for young people around the world based on their lived experience and how they might already be living the climate crisis in their day-to-day lives and not just as a kind of perceived existential threat. Do you want to kick this one off?
I feel like it's normal to kind of feel paralyzed in this. Like, we're literally facing the biggest issue of our life, and our bodies are basically saying fight or flight, and a lot of the time it is flight. And for me, I feel like it's very important to tell my story with its entirety. Through the years of 16 to around 19, I didn't do anything. I was so scared. I was going, oh, okay, if I could fit my trash into one jam jar, I can save the world. Literally, and like going to like 4 different bulk shops to do my weekly shop, because if I felt like I wasn't, I felt that I was the reason why this was happening, and that's a reality for a lot of young people. And it was only when I kind of came into community and actually had a space to hold the grief, and I had a moment of going, oh God, I'm not okay, and this is affecting me far more than I'd ever thought it has. Was I able to kind of have this moment of I guess, like, I would say, like, catharsis of all the feelings I'd been holding for years. And through that journey was when I kind of allowed myself to go, okay, so now I'm having this moment. I'm actually fully sitting in what feels like a very uncomfortable space of facing this problem. And then what resources do I need in order to be able to create the action that I know needs to happen next? And whether that was re-educating myself, whether that was even, I think there is something about young people, and I'm not even talking about like us, I'm talking about children, because they see the world so clearly, it's kind of crazy. Like, I remember my first year of university, I taught a primary school, and I would teach them debating. So we were talking about the climate crisis, I explained fossil fuels. So I'm like, oh yeah, so our Earth creates these fossil fuels and they're in the ground, and what we do is bring them back up, we burn them again, then they go into our air, and then they cause loads of issues. And then they were like, what do you mean? And I was like, do you want me to explain it again? They were like, no, that just doesn't make any sense. And I was like, yeah, actually, it doesn't make any sense. And that kind of quite like clear right and wrong, it's amazing. But then also like the visions for what they have for the future that we can build, because they aren't they haven't been socialized into believing this is it. They kind of see the world so clearly, and I think this is where, the idea of youth is not just about age, but it's about thought. How can we stay youthful, especially when we're moving into becoming the people who are holding the power? How do we end up kind of usurping it and basically saying, I think these power systems are wrong, and therefore I'm going to disseminate again, and there is something quite amazing about having that. And I feel going forward, this is all of our responsibility to be able to say, it feels overwhelming, yes. It feels like I can't, breathe. But then it's like, what resources do I need to take action? And this is different for everyone. And I feel like this is kind of the journey into moving into action,
Yeah. Thank you. Dominique?
Definitely. And I think when it comes to emotions, it's something that I still don't feel that is truly acknowledged when it comes to the climate crisis, and just how important it is. Even when it comes to emotive language and the narrative, I think young people have had such an incredible part in that, in using emotive language. Like, I feel like my future's being betrayed, I fear for the future, and loving our planet, and all of these different emotions have really had a big impact in people suddenly seeing a shift from the climate crisis just being statistics and numbers, and this is just emissions, and feeling really disconnected from it, to seeing young people, even their own children and those around them, saying that they're really scared about their futures and about the climate ecological breakdown that's happening, and that's really pushed a lot of people to think about the climate crisis differently, and I think that's made people feel a lot more urgent in that way. And I think using emotion that way is really important, and it doesn't take away from the message, it doesn't take away from how serious it is, it doesn't take away from how much knowledge someone has, even though it's seen that way when you use quite emotive language. It's really important to realize that we're all human beings and we all have human responses to this, and the climate crisis can really cause those emotions. And I think that's been a really big part of shifting the narrative there. And also when it comes to eco-anxiety, I do think it's especially different for those who are on like the front lines. I know I experienced a lot of fear when it came to the health aspects of it when I saw like the illegal levels of air pollution in my community in South London. But also I was born in America, and I also have family in Jamaica, and they're both experiencing impacts of the climate crisis in different ways. So Jamaica being at risk due to rising sea levels, and when it comes to America, lots of the different like inequalities there, and environmental issues and extreme weather impacts that are happening. And so for me, being directly connected to my family in those countries, in those positions in a way, really heightened the eco-anxiety for me. And I feel like that connection is also something we really need to push more to people, not to experience eco-anxiety, but to really understand how this is deeply affecting people. And I think that makes a massive difference when you have that human connection, and also the connection to nature and our ecosystem and animals and everything. I think that connection is a really important part as well. Although it can cause eco-anxiety, for me it's been incredibly crucial. It's been crucial in combating eco-anxiety as well.
I think I'd echo all of that. I don't understand any of the climate science. In a dead serious way, I'm really bad at science. I don't understand any of the jargon. I can't look at these reports in any way more than like a surface level sense. I just don't get it. But I understand the principles. And honestly, that's enough for me. Because I would echo what everyone here has said, which is that emotions are really our greatest asset. They're our most powerful tool. Apathy can be turned into anger, which can be turned into action. It's with the right push, that pipeline is totally possible, and it's something that all of us have very clearly experienced. Because everyone else has touched on like eco-anxiety before getting involved in organising, I'll just tell a story of when in the first week of September of 2019, after like months and months of upending my entire life. It was the beginning of year 13. I didn't know what was going to happen. I had to apply to universities, and everything was up in the air. And I'd been working for months and months with everyone here on organising what is to stake the largest climate demonstration of all time across the world. And I had a breakdown. It was like 2 a.m, and I'd just closed my laptop, and I had school the next day. And I just sobbed, and I literally called out to my parents to come to my bedroom, and I was just like, and they were like, what's going on? And I was like, well, what if we fail? Like, what if in 2 weeks' time we try to put on this huge mobilisation and all eyes are on us, and like 3 people show up and nothing happens and no one listens? And it was terrifying, and I just sobbed for hours. And I'll never forget my parents saying this to me, because they've always been very supportive, and my family is very engaged in politics, and we always have been. So I grew up with like newspapers on the table, and with a lot of education, a lot of questions, and a lot of answers. And they just said to me, okay, and so what? Like, no one shows up. Like, 3 people show up. They literally said, like, do you know how many times 3 people had to show up to a protest in order for you to be here, willing to put this work in, willing to keep going? They said, okay, so you think like 2019 has been this year of like millions and millions of people joining in the movement, but like 5 years ago we had the same thing, and 10 years ago we had the same thing, and each time people come, and each time it joins and it grows. And you can't like totally give up hope out of the fear that one time it won't work. So they don't listen. So you go bigger. So you keep trying. So you go harder. And that has driven me so far, because we do fail. We fail all the time. The fact that we haven't won yet is proof of that. You know, the fact that we haven't yet succeeded in totally changing these power systems is proof that we've failed again and again, because we've been blocked at every corner, because we've had to face immense obstacles, because we've had to re-socialize ourselves into integrating hope into every part of our lives, into seeing our communities as places for joy and solace and respite, rather than something to be afraid of, and instead kind of, pivoting to the grind and hustle culture and consumerism. We've had a lot of work to do, and every single day that grows, and every single day people join. And I remember 3 months ago hearing a Spotify advert of someone who was running a podcast, and she said she'd been inspired to run a podcast on young people because she'd attended the climate strike of September 2019. And that was 2 years later, and it blew my mind, but it was also a reminder that people grow and are inspired and are mobilized so much more than we ever think. And that, to me, has always been a method and strategy for me to keep my anxiety, my very real fears of the movement's failure and of apocalypse and of the world ending at bay. Because, okay, so maybe you're an optimist and maybe you're a pessimist. I don't care. Whatever drives you to do the work, that's your method. Those are your emotions. Just manipulate them and use them and channel them into getting out there, into organizing. Whatever drives you, that's okay. Just help build this movement, create that outcome, be a part of the solution.
And I think it's actually also looking at like the long scale. So I studied history in university, and obviously I had to take a couple modules in social movement theory. But the idea is like we are literally unrooting like problematic systems that have been around for literal hundreds of years. And I feel like when you actually look at like what we have achieved in such a small time frame, it shows like actually we are kind of really successful, And I remember having a very similar situation. This was before the Extinction Rebellion, the first Extinction Rebellion. I was working in XR Youth with Dominique actually, and it was 3 a.m. the night before, the April the 14th, on that night, the morning of April the 15th. I'd been working on outreach and logistics for XR Youth. We had our little youth site, the heart of the rebellion, as you would imagine. And we had that moment of breakdown, and we were like, what if no one shows up? We had 300 people on our Facebook page that said they're coming to the event, and we were like, so cut that in half. Let's just say I prepared for 200 people to show up, and the next day we had around 10,000 of young people basically saying enough's enough. And I think it just shows, like, even though, it's one, like, the fact that, like, there are so many people who are around us who are doing the same work that we might not see visible, but they are there. But then also it just kind of shows, like, if we can just keep showing up over long periods of time, that's when we'll really get what we want. Because this isn't going to be something that we can solve, even in the 8-year time frame that the IPC lends out for us. This is going to be like a journey of a lifetime, and we have to be ready for that. We have to be prepared for that long-term thinking, because that's what's got us here, is all these short-term thinking.
Yeah, definitely just re-emphasizing that. I think as you guys were speaking, it really just reminded me and gave me like flashbacks, as you can say, to moments where that happened. The last strike in September, where I just had a week of just panic attacks, really, because I was really, really scared that it would fail. But when you think about how far we've come, and you think about even how far the narrative has shifted and how many more people have been inspired and how many more people are tuned in, it just shows that we are winning. It hasn't happened yet, but we are winning, and we are many, and collectively we are powerful. And I think that's something that really needs to be driven home to a lot of people. Yeah.
I loved that role. That was amazing. We touched on this idea of really leaning into emotions, or oftentimes not even feeling that we have any agency over that, but just kind of being sucked into them. And I think 2019 was a very defining year for a lot of young climate activists, social justice activists. I remember it was a real turning point for me, because by that point, I was 11 when I declared myself, an environmentalist at the dinner table. And my parents tried to be as supportive as they could be. But, I had really suppressed a lot of those feelings that woke me up to the crisis. And I think I had this kind of reinforcement of every time I would show up on a panel, every time I would use my voice, you know, the adults in the room would say, oh, you're so positive, you're so inspiring, you give me hope. And I didn't realize that I was actually disallowing those difficult, darker feelings. And it wasn't until November of 2019 that that all came to a head. So it was the backdrop of the Youth Strikes for Climate, but at the same time, the fires were raging back home in Australia. And up until that point, you know, the climate crisis was something that I read about in articles. It was something that I watched in documentaries. Like, I lived firmly in a bubble of climate privilege. And it wasn't until November of 2019 where every time I would look down at my phone, I would see the Instagram stories of friends rushing from their houses, standing on the roofs of their homes, trying to beat back the flames. The headlines of 2 billion animals have been incinerated in this inferno. And I struggled against those feelings until I had this breaking point where I would just spontaneously cry in the shower on my way to work in the middle of meetings, much to the dismay of polite British society. And I realized that I couldn't struggle against them anymore. I was like, I need to surrender to this experience. And it was there, kind of at the bottom of that well of emotion, that I realized the true gift of those feelings, because I realized that we hadn't solved the climate crisis because we've gotten so good as a culture at numbing ourselves, at kind of sleepwalking, even as the science tells us that we're hurtling toward this cliff of climate collapse. And you touched on it, you know, that eco-anxiety, that discomfort, that pain, those are the internal alarm bells. You know, that's what tells us something here is really, really wrong. You know, and I think young people, because the consequence of apathy and inaction is our future, right? And the future of humanity, we don't have the choice or privilege to switch off from those feelings, and more so for the young people who are already living through the direct impacts of the climate crisis. Like, they don't have a choice over their anxiety or PTSD or whether they can just switch off climate news. Like, they're living right through it. And I honestly feel that one of the most powerful levers that we have to really mobilize systemic level action is to bring these emotions into the kind of stuffy spaces, right? Into the decision-making rooms. And I think we were all at COP26. Not that anyone missed out on anything if you weren't there. But I remember looking around and just thinking how sanitized everything was. You know, there was no greenery, there were no plants. It was a lot of, old white people generally in suits, kind of talking about the climate crisis as this very convenient issue, something that we can tiptoe around the edges of. And yet there was none of what is at stake really in that room, and that wasn't truly being felt. But I feel that if we give ourselves license to lean into those emotions, then we can begin to give the people around us license to do the same. Dominique.
Yeah, I feel like the moments of the table was really shaken at COP was inside the building was when not just young people, but there were the delegations from island nations, for example, that were speaking about what was happening to their homes, and young people speaking about the future. And it was from that place of emotion, as well as talking about the science and talking about the facts of what was happening, that really shook people up. And even though we feel as though global leaders have been aware of this for so long, and by now they must be in tune to it, there are still a lot of leaders that were really shocked by the level of emotion and were really shaken up by the speeches and those who were within those spaces who were protesting and standing up. And it really goes to show where that disconnect still is. And I found that to be just incredibly powerful at COP26, and that's what I really took away over everything else that didn't happen.
Yeah, there was a beautiful speech from Elizabeth Watuti, who is an amazing Kenyan environmental activist, who I encourage you all to check out. And in her speech, she didn't talk about the solutions. She didn't talk about, what needed to happen on an institutional level. She just encouraged everyone to lean into the pain. She said, open your hearts to the discomfort, open your hearts to the sadness, to the grief. And from that place, we can find the courage, we can find the fuel to keep showing up, to keep taking action.
Yeah, I think it's really easy to see how like desanitized we've become, and how intentional that disconnect between us and the climate crisis at all was for so many years. I mean, I remember hearing, oh, haha, climate change, like so many times as this like joke, like someone would do something that wasn't environmentally friendly and they'd be like, whoa, climate change. And it was just like, it just became this total background, like white noise. But embracing that courage and that empathy and letting those emotions rule our decisions rather than trying to separate like emotions and policy making as if decisions over our lives and as if the system in which we live doesn't have any impact on our well-being, and on the way in which we navigate that, which, you know, is obviously a ridiculous concept. That embracing of those emotions, acceptance that you need to rely on the world around you, you need that connection with nature, and we don't have access to that. As terrifying and as heartbreaking as that is the only way that we can move forward. There has to be such a teaching of radical acceptance in so many of our spaces. And sometimes that means coming face to face with really ugly truths, such as, am I a part of the problem? How much do I benefit from this problem? And those are all questions we can ask ourselves. And how far removed have I become from collective change? How little do I understand social theories of change? How little do I understand the real history of social movements? How open is this space for me? Is there something that is exclusionary that maybe I've been a part of, or that is excluding me? How can I change that? What do I have? What skills do I have? What can I contribute to this movement? Because you can contribute everything, and the answers are immense. But just asking these really honest and difficult questions to ourselves and to the people around us can change so much more than you think. And those words and that emotive language and the ideas of action and inspiration are everything. They're the foundation of our movements.
Yeah, and this is like, you know, our vulnerability is our strongest strength. And I feel like when I kind of had that moment of, you know, that deep moment, that's when I kind of found my voice, you know, and like the work that you're describing, I typically call it the inner work. And that's the first step to how we get to the cultures and ways and systems that we deserve. You know, it's asking ourselves, where do I sit in this society? Where am I the problem? Where do I face the problem? And how can I move into a way of re-socializing myself into better, re-socializing myself to get prepared for the paradigm that I'm hoping is coming, you know, and that's a really radical step. It's a radical step of hope. And I think there is something about like sitting in your emotions, and I think that comes with that first step. And I typically brand it as like the self-care. It's not the, you know, it's not the face mask on the Sunday. It's the real self-care, the really saying, you know, like, am I doing the inner work? Saying, where do I sit? What do I feel discomfort with, and how do I move not past it but through it, you know? And it's in like, it is actively kind of like allowing those emotions to happen, which is very scary, but I think it's what's got me here today. And I always sign off my letters with love and rage, and it's a very like well-known activist phrase, and it's about the love that you have for life, for the planet, for everything, but then the rage that you have at the injustice, and that we can only have both of them to really get to the place that we want, you know? It's not about being hopeful, it's not about being angry, it's about how do I find this middle ground of knowing that the intentions of every action I take is in love, duty, and care. And I don't just ask this for myself or you guys, I ask this from decision makers, I ask this for policy makers, I ask this from government. Have you thought about how your policies are affecting people? Do you think they're based in love, duty, and care? And if they're not the policies for us. Because let's not forget, like the social contract, it's us giving parts of our rights away to our government for them to protect us. And if they're not doing that, that means that we should rebel.
I'd love to open this space for any questions that might have come up. Yes.
Okay, so thank you so much, all of you. This has been... I wasn't supposed to say it, was I? But I have a question because, and I'm very curious because you've talked about these conversations and these ways that you work with leaders, business leaders, policymakers, and sort of help them to, hopefully to empower them and make them feel what they can do. And I'm wondering, because there are generational differences, right? So there are, you know, talking to these sort of old white people or, you know, whoever you're talking to. And I've been so impressed with the sort of Generation Z emotional intelligence, I think, that you guys have, and that you can, yeah, I think it really is your strength. It's something that I feel, and I'm trying to get more emotionally intelligent myself, and you know, opening up about vulnerability, about emotions, about feelings, like how, you know, what are the challenges, I guess? Because I know that opening up and being vulnerable is one thing, but how does it work, and what are your challenges when you're having those conversations with people who are, you know, in their 50s, 60s or whatever, and who may be having these conversations really for the first time?
Do you want to? Okay.
So polite, isn't it?
I think they're really hard. I think we are incredibly brave to be so vulnerable. I think that much of that bravery comes from the fact that we're very young. And I don't necessarily think that the naivety that's often attached to that as like a little buzzword or like a, oh, gotcha, is as bad as people make it out to be. I think it's actually incredibly helpful for our bravery and our courage that we have spent less time being kind of downtrodden by systemic horrors. And obviously that's a massive generalization, but we've just been less likely to face tragedy because we've been around for less time. But what we have faced is a real upheaval in the way that we respect one another's emotions and the way that we respect one another's vulnerability. And the way that we talk about mental health is so open now. It's very far from perfect, but it's very different from the way it used to be. I mean, I had a lot of struggles with mental health, and that taught me so much about being vulnerable and being willing to be open. And I'd like to think that so many of my friends who struggled as well, because we supported one another, that taught us a lot about just committing to those conversations non-stop. And that is a constant driver and a constant factor. And I don't think it's that we're not aware that there is that generational differences around kind of mental health and vulnerability and being willing to respect differences in emotional intelligence and in emotional maturity. But I do think it's given us the advantage that we're willing to seek out those solutions no matter what, and that we're willing to take the time to work out what does someone need to access that level of emotional intelligence, whether it's like literally just seeking therapy and professional care, or is it something that, you know, is because of an economic factor where you're missing community connections and familial connections and joy in your life? Is there something greater that is just like a constant obstacle, whether it's around money or an inability to access green spaces and have kind of a connection to nature as a human right? There's a lot that I think we respect and acknowledge from older generations that we've seen from like our parents and the differences. I remember my mum saying to me once about like a more personal thing, and she was like, you know, sometimes it's okay to just take a step back, but I'm saying that from the generation that lost all our battles. And I remember thinking about that and hearing, well, that's just not true. I mean, your generation made a huge difference, and so many things happened that pushed us forward. We're just picking up where that front line fell or was stopped, and we're just driving forward. And I think it's really hard, and I'm probably not allowed to swear in here, but it's really fucking intense. And it's really, really difficult. And I think that's okay. And I think because we take the time to care for one another, and I mean, all of us have met through doing this climate stuff, and we all have a really intense respect and love and admiration for one another. And that means that if any of these three called me up and they were like, I'm going through a really hard time, I'd be there. Because we understand that love is a work in progress, and it's an action rather than just a feeling. And it's a constant internal dialogue, it's a constant internal work. And I don't think it comes easily or naturally to anyone, but it is possible for everyone.
Wow, that was amazing. Inspiring. I'd also say that one of the difficulties and challenges I've had when having these conversations is people unlearning what they've been told their whole lives. So as Noga pointed out, the idea of powerlessness, for example, it's like pointing out, it's like actually your generation did make like massive changes as well, and actually you can look at the power of the people and the power that you have. And I think also just unlearning the ideas that this is just how it's supposed to be, and because that's one of the special things that comes with being a young person, is that we haven't had as long to be conditioned into these ideas and into this society, and so we're automatically thinking of different ways. And I think sometimes, even I've in the past found it difficult to really extend the patience and understanding to other people and like other older family members to understand where they're at and how their experiences have shaped how they see the world. And so I think unlearning that together is really important, and really just extending love and care in everything that we do, and meeting people where they're at is so important.
Yeah. And I think you touched on a really important point, Naga, about like the safety of being vulnerable. And that's something that a lot of people, especially, you know, I do a lot of consultancy with big corporations, and it's like they don't have the safety of feeling vulnerable. So it's very kind of like jarring for them when I come in and I'm like, you get what I mean? Like I'm just like spewing all my emotions, you know, because they're like, what the hell? I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to confront this, you know. And I think there's something about what young people have done so well, and I think we could even see this at like the beginning of XR Youth when I first met Dominique, was like, we learned how to hold space for each other because we knew that the adults didn't know how to hold space for us. They did not know how to hold space for the emotions that we were feeling around climate anxiety. But now what I do is I hold space and break down those barriers for, you know, people in those generations. Like I work as an artist in residence at a nature reserve, and part of my consultancy is bringing them to the nature reserve and encouraging them to play. And you have not seen joy until you've seen a 40-year-old man rolling around in mud. And that's the kind of like the breath that they are waiting to take, and they just need to know that they're safe in this space to be able to take it, you know, because I'm maybe I'm naive, but I don't think there are bad people in this world. I think there are people who are hard trodden by. I think there are people who don't feel safe and are acting out of that space of mistrust and scarcity and being scared of the world. And what we need to do is learn as a community of humans all across the world, how can we create safe spaces for each other to be able to have that real emotional vulnerability that saves the world.
Yeah, and just quickly adding on to that, also trying to be accessible with our climate information is something I've learned a lot more, how to communicate climate and environmental issues. If I just kind of say, hey, I read the latest IPCC report, this is everything that's happening, these are all the scientific facts, you need to understand this. It doesn't go in, and it actually took me a while to take that in and be like, maybe I need to make this more understandable and not expect everyone to have read the latest IPCC report. I think having that understanding is really important too.
Not even just the understanding, it's like it's coming from many different places. Like I love the fact that you're like, I don't get the climate science. Because for me, as long as I know someone's hurting out there, it means I should probably be doing something about it, you know? And it's like that kind of like quite simplicity in it, you know? And I think there's so many times you try to speak to someone and it's kind of like speaking Russian to someone who doesn't know how to speak Russian. Because like what you're doing is you're saying, this is how I understand things and you should meet me where I'm at, not rather this is how you understand things and I need to meet you where you're at. And I think I can speak to this because I was writing a strategy for a campaigning group, and I did all these, I sat down in loads of chicken and chip shops in Tottenham to talk to them about how do they see the climate crisis. How do they see the actions that are taken on the streets? Why is there not active engagement from communities like this? And kind of having that moment of me meeting them, one, physically where they're at, while they were having dinners after work, but then also me hearing their opinion and me basically shutting up. I wasn't there to preach at them. I was there to say, how can we work together? And hearing their issues around how they feel about the government, how they're feeling the government are trying to take away their rights, how they feel scared into doing action for whether it's themselves and the communities that are facing the climate crisis in the UK, or whether it's their people who live back home where their families are from. They're scared because they think Priti Patel is going to come to their house and take their passport. You know, so it's like, how do we make sure we're addressing the everyday issues as well as the end of the world issues? How can we get people to recognize that they're all connected? And that's how we can take action against all of it.
Yeah, I would say like the world and nature and power and climate change, these are not abstract concepts. They're not just like random entities. They're things that are very real and very tangible and have very serious material impacts on our lives. And of course, the more like intersectional identities that you identify with and the more marginalized your background is, the more real and more tangible, more serious those impacts are. But whenever you're working in this environmentalist space, you have to remember that every single one of us has a relationship with these things that we've kind of been taught to see as like conceptualizations, but are actually obviously very, very tangible. And because these are relationships, we have to treat them like one. We have to cultivate relationships and we have to engage in communication and honesty. And I think that is such a baseline for all the work that we do, which is creating, recognizing, acknowledging, and cultivating those relationships with power systems, with ourselves, with each other. And it's hard work, as any relationship is. It's hard work and it requires vulnerability and it requires change and it requires honesty and openness and space and communication. But it will form our entire future.
What a beautiful place to end. That hour has absolutely flown past, but I want to say a huge thank you to our panelists here. Round of applause for all of your contributions. That has been such a nourishing conversation, and you'll all have an opportunity to come up and chat to these three folks before we break out into the solution circles, so more intimate kind of conversations about some of the themes we've talked about today. In the meantime, I believe there are also some pastries and coffee and tea in the back, as I know I'm very hungry, and I can imagine some people here are too. So yeah, thank you all so much.
Thank you, Clover. Wow.
Oh, Clover, is this being all being? Oh yeah, it's all being live streamed.
Yeah,
so I was thinking about
17 people
yeah.
tuning in live.
That's good.